St. Anthony's Garden. This tour will take you around the back of St. Louis Cathedral, down Pere Antoine Alley to St. Anthony's Garden, and up Pirates Alley back to the front of the cathedral. Beginning to the right of St. Louis Cathedral, if you are facing it, you will find Pere Antoine Alley. Named in honor of Father Antonio de Sedea, who was known affectionately as Pere Antoine to locals, which is Father Antonio in French. He is often referred to as the most beloved priest of New Orleans. He is certainly one of the most remembered. Pere Antoine was the priest who married both Marie Laveau and Delphine Lalaurie. More on Pere Antoine later. Notice the wrought iron decorating the cathedral. From this close angle, you can see the skilled handwork that went into completing it. Pere Antoine Alley is a pedestrian walkway between the Presbytère and the cathedral from Chartres to Royal Streets. It was once known as St. Anthony Alley, and you can find many mid-century postcards with this name online. Originally, it was called Orleans Alley, as was its sibling, Pirates Alley. To ease the confusion, they each adopted names honoring different aspects of New Orleans history. The pirates of the Barataria Bay, immortalized by Jean Lafitte in the constant Catholicism of the colony, whether French or Spanish. Before long, the common names were adopted as official. By 1889, St. Antoine's Alley was in popular use, and by 1922, Pirates Alley was known, according to Shannon Lee Dottie's research. As you walk along the alley, you'll see a doorway decorated by Doric columns and flags of the Archdiocese. Above it, there is an often ignored statue of St. Louis. I've just let you in on one of my favorite secrets in New Orleans, as not many people realize this statue exists, including tour guides with decades of experience. This door leads to offices of the Archdiocese of New Orleans and the Presbytère. Originally, this was a cluster of buildings to house the priests. The Presbytère was designed in 1791 and completed in 1813. It became a courthouse in 1834, and then a portion of the Louisiana State Museum in 1911. Today, you can find a Mardi Gras display and a Hurricane Katrina installation in the front part of the building, but the offices here are closed to the public. Continuing, you will see the first view of St. Anthony's Garden on your left as you pass the St. Louis entrance. The gardens behind the church weren't always exactly in this area. The road that intersects with the church is Orleans Avenue, which originally ran all the way to the back of the church, and then around the church on either side to Chartres Street. The garden would have been in the square on the left of Orleans Avenue if you were facing the back of the church, so about where you are standing now. In 1721, the Capuchin friars arrived in New Orleans. Letters from the Father Superior of the mission in 1723 do not yet mention a garden. In fact, the letters detail a lack of even a church yet. Quote, "For 6 months we have had at New Orleans only a small room, which served as a chapel and a kitchen, another to lodge 4 religious, and a third to store our provisions and effects." Unquote. Rafael de Luxembourg wrote. The excavation revealed that for the next several decades, the space was used for a market and housing, including the home of Pere Antoine. In 1763, Louisiana became a Spanish colony, and the Spanish Capuchin friars were sent in 1772 to replace the French. However, Fray Antonio de Sedea, the friar who would become known as Pere Antoine, did not arrive until around 1780. It is said that Pere Antoine kept a sparse residence in New Orleans and St. Anthony's Garden until his death in 1829, and there is archaeological evidence that he did. Pere Antoine was the priest in New Orleans who plays into many of the stories that shape our history. He both baptized and married Marie Laveau. He married Delphine to Dr. Lalaurie, and he married the first American governor of Louisiana, William C.C. Claiborne, to his third wife. He was supposedly sent to New Orleans as part of the Spanish Inquisition. In a 1919 appreciation piece for the Louisiana Historical Society, Clarence Wyatt Bispham writes, quote, "We first notice him in the stern and harsh garb of the attempted administrator of the Inquisition. No country in all the world was so bound hand and foot by the Inquisition as Spain. No city was more free from this heavy burden than New Orleans under French domination." Unquote. Pere Antoine is ultimately a controversial figure whose biography seemed to be clouded by the glow of a post-life halo perpetuated by the church's propaganda and the complicit journalists and tour guides who repeat it. But as always, the truth is much more interesting than the sanitized fiction. BizFam claims that there are three competing views of Pere Antoine. Number 1, a saintly and generous priest. Number 2, a controversial figure, to put it mildly, who may have been a criminal. And finally, number 3, quote, a scheming, adventurous, and dangerous man who must be carefully watched, unquote. He was born in Ceuta, Spain in 1748 on November 18th and became a priest in 1771 in Granada. He came to New Orleans in 1780. In an 1878 article in the Times-Democrat, he is described, quote, he seems to have had a grand old face, long and yet massive in its length. If one might speak of the architecture of a face, I should say that his was Gothic, of the middle period. His snowy beard flowed down even to the hempen girdle at his waist, and together with his tonsure lent him the holy aspect of a medieval St. Anthony. His habit was of the coarsest brown material, and his naked feet were protected by wooden sandals, unquote. He was the priest who refused to ring the bells on Good Friday in 1788 when a fire broke out at the residence of Don Vicente Jose Nunez, the treasurer who was praying with candles near a curtain in unusual wind. The story goes that Pere Antoine insisted that Good Friday was a solemn day and bells should not be rung. Or perhaps it was impossible to ring the bells because they had been wrapped with cotton to prevent the inadvertent ringing due to high winds. Regardless, 80% of the city, including the cathedral, was destroyed. In 1790, he was exiled back to Spain for 5 years. Some older biographies point to sinful behavior of adultery and even murder as the reason for the beloved priest's exile. Richard Greenleaf claims it was for inquisitorial behavior that was polarizing the colony in his article, The Inquisition in Spanish Louisiana, 1762 through 1800. Greenleaf quotes Governor Miro, who wrote, quote, these foreigners are imbued with and very frightened of the power of the holy office, which they consider absolutely despotic and discriminatory, notwithstanding the uprightness, stature, and circumspection of its most just proceedings, unquote. The construction of a new church, known today as Almanasser's Church, as he was the major patron, began in 1789. The city burned again in December 1794, but the new church was spared and dedicated as a cathedral on December 24, 1794. After the fires, many people sought refuge in St. Anthony's Garden, where Pere Antoine had his shack, in temporary housing as so many people were homeless. But this housing was not free. Shannon Lee Doughty points out in Archaeological Investigations at St. Anthony's Garden, Volume 2, that there were rental fees attached to the temporary housing, which provided income for the church. Pere Antoine appealed his exile and ultimately returned to New Orleans in 1795. He was elected rector of the church at the beginning of the 19th century after the church attempted to remove his priestly authority. Very few of the modern biographies seem to include much of the controversy surrounding Pere Antoine's time in New Orleans or his exile from the city. He is honored by his nickname on Pere Antoine Alley. According to Catholic.com, quote, few priests have been more assailed by historians, but a careful comparison of the ancient records of the cathedral with the traditions that cluster about his memory show that he did not deserve, on the one hand, the indignities which historians heap upon him, nor the excessive honors with which tradition has crowned him. From the cathedral archives, it has been proven that he was simply an earnest priest, striving to do what he thought his duty amid many difficulties, unquote. Pere Antoine died in 1829, and his funeral was apparently a huge display attracting people of all religions, races, and classes, who seemingly completely forgot about his initial Inquisition intentions. According to some, the newspapers requested the presence of Freemasons at his funeral, particularly the members of l'Étoile Polaire. Curious for a Catholic priest to earn such respect from the Masons, as Catholics are forbidden from joining to this day. After the Good Friday Fire of 1788 destroyed most of the colony, and just before Pere Antoine's exile, the space was used as a refugee camp until homes could be rebuilt. After Pere Antoine died, his reign over St. Anthony's Garden ended, and the square took another form. They found small ceramics next in the historical record and believe the muddy roads were once poetically paved with broken pottery. It was known for some time as Ballinger Square because of a local billiards hall owner who operated the corner of Royal in Orleans and who leased the square from the city. During the antebellum period, roughly 1830 to 1848, the road running through it was removed. It was primarily used as a pleasure garden with vendors such as ice cream, flowers, and alcoholic beverages. When the cathedral was renovated in the mid-19th century, the church was also expanded, claiming some of the space in both alleys and the garden. Around this time, the city gave the land to the church. The iron fence was added in 1848, which ended the public pleasure garden period of St. Anthony's Garden. Few artifacts are found from this time. In 1909, a bombing inside the church blew out the stained glass windows, and colored glass was found in the excavation. The obelisk was added in 1914. Under it are the remains of 19 soldiers who died at a quarantine station near New Orleans in 1857. In 1920, water lines were added beneath the garden. The statue of the Sacred Heart of Jesus is sometimes known to locals as Touchdown Jesus because of the dramatic shadow it casts on the building at night. It was added in 1926. The excavation revealed children's toys in the last 100 years of artifacts, indicating this was a play area for the school Cathedral Academy, and coins along Pirates Alley side, possibly from the art market that began around this time and continues today. It was renovated again in 1941 by architect Richard Koch and the landscape architect William Wydor. This iteration of the gardens added boxwood pathways according to the Cultural Landscape Foundation. It was renovated again in 2002 by Alvarez and Bassick Design Group, who added a brick path and replaced damaged foliage. St. Anthony's Garden was completely destroyed during Hurricane Katrina in 2005. This allowed a rare French Quarter excavation in 2008 and 2009. One more renovation was completed after the excavation in 2011, using the information gained from the excavation in the redesign. The excavation filled in some of the gaps in the historical records, showing us where the former structures were situated and providing indications that an informal marketplace operated in the area in the early colony. Quote, "The artifactual evidence points to the explanation that the market evolved out of a tradition established in the early French period in which Native American visitors, traders, neonates, and/or laborers were allowed to make a temporary home in the city on this bit of unclaimed land under the watchful eyes of the church and the adjacent guardhouse." Unquote. Doughty writes. The archaeological evidence also showed a preference for Native American styles of dress, with many beads found instead of European buttons, further revealing how much the indigenous people and the colonists interacted in the early colonial days. Quote, "The density of artifacts associated with known Native American practices in manufacture, labor, and style throughout the French colonial period minimally suggests the strong influence of Native American culture on early New Orleans, but most likely indicates the significant presence of Native Americans themselves," unquote, Doughty explains. Quote, "This discrepancy between the archaeological and historical records helps clarify that the French accounts probably took for granted the Native American milieu into which the foreigners had inserted themselves. The textual invisibility of Native Americans in the historical record thus should be revised to be read as a presumed presence rather than an absence, at least in the first generation of settlement in the 1710s and 1720s." Unquote. In addition to what we learned from the excavation of St. Anthony's Garden, We know that the Native Americans had at least a trading post called Bulbancha in the area that Bienville decided would be the capital of French Louisiana. Bulbancha means place of many tongues in a Choctaw dialect. We also know that Bienville had a relatively peaceful relationship with Native Americans. He was known to have been tattooed by Native Americans, and he is said to have learned the Mobilian dialect. Mobilian was a common dialect that different tribes used to communicate as they had different languages. Mobilian would have been the language used to trade at Bulbancha, the place of many tongues. It possibly led Bienville to believe he had learned many different Native American languages, as he could effectively communicate with those who spoke different languages. Dottie suggests that the cordial relationship between the colonists and the Native Americans probably ended around 1729, when the colonists disrespected the Natchez, who revolted as a result, leading the French to become less trusting and more violent toward the Native Americans. The Venerable Henriette Delille. Look to the ground in front of St. Anthony's Garden and you'll see a plaque installed for Henriette Delille, founder of the Sisters of the Holy Family. In 1836, Henriette Delille founded the order that became the Sisters of the Holy Family in 1842, which is the second oldest surviving religious order of African American women. At the time, it was illegal for gatherings of people of color. Further, people of color were not allowed to join religious life. There wasn't a group for Henriette to join, so she created her own, in defiance of the laws restricting gatherings of people of African descent. For reference, the man remembered as the first Black priest, Father Augustus Tolton, was ordained in 1886, 44 years after the Sisters of the Holy Family were established. Henriette was born in New Orleans or nearby in 1812 or 1813. She was a free person of color who is said to be the result of a Plaçage arrangement. Her father was Jean-Baptiste Lille Sarpi, or Juan Bautista Sarpi in the Spanish records. Her mother was Marie Joseph Diaz. Henriette was a cousin to Marie Laveau, the Voodoo Queen, and her great-great-grandmother was enslaved. Her early life is not well documented, but her mother seems to have suffered from mental illness, and her father was not a part of her life. A baptismal record has not been located for Henriette, but she appears in the records frequently as the godmother of enslaved children and as a witness to marriages starting in 1827, around 14 years old. Most sources say she was groomed to become a placé like her mother. The records show she gave birth to 2 sons before she received the sacrament of confirmation in 1834 at age 21. Both sons died young. By the 1840s, all sources agree that she had rejected her place as a placé and established her religious order to serve enslaved people and others in need, primarily through education, despite the regulations on people of color. The Sisters of the Holy Family were prevented from wearing habits to denote their religious status in the early history of the convent. In the same place where Teoh laws required women of color to wear headscarves to cover their hair, women who had devoted their lives to the Catholic Church were prevented from wearing traditional head coverings. Around the 1870s, the Sisters of the Holy Family were granted permission to wear a habit after Henriette's death, so none of her images have a habit. But the Sisters of the Holy Family continue the tradition of wearing their habit to this day. I could not find Henriette in the newspaper record by that name during her lifetime. Her religious name was possibly Marie Theresa, but we also have no official record that she was ever a vowed sister. The old Ursuline convent has an image of an obituary written in French for her. I found several references after her death to her as Henriette Delille, which is a different spelling but the same pronunciation of Delille. The lack of documentary evidence of Henriette's life has frustrated researchers and historians. The Venerable Henriette Delille is currently in the process of becoming a saint. Along with the Venerable Augustus Tolton, the first Black priest, and the Venerable Pere Toussaint, a remarkable layperson, she is among the first American-born people of African descent who have begun the process for sainthood and the only woman. In other words, Mother Henriette will be one of the first Black saints, if not the first. She has been declared a servant of God and venerable by 2 popes. You can find a chapel devoted to her in the old baptistry in the vestibule of St. Louis Cathedral. The street that St. Augustine Church is on is also named for her. Henriette Delille is a soon-to-be Catholic saint, a free person of color, a descendant of the first families of New Orleans, and a quintessential New Orleanian. Her story represents an American experience, the good and the bad, and is another example of why New Orleans is the most American city. Her experience in New Orleans as a free person of color was uniquely American, and for better or worse, her story will represent the American story of a saint. It is fitting that the first American-born saint of African heritage is a New Orleanian and a descendant of both the enslaved people and most prominent families of this city. New Orleans is described as the most African city in America, and the most Caribbean city in America, and the most European city in America. I agree that we are all of these things all the time, a combination that is deeply American, just like Mother Henriette. The plaque noting her significance names this location Place de Henriette Delille. The irony of honoring her this way when she rejected her placé destiny is not lost on me. As you walk past Orleans Avenue, you'll see the Bourbon Orleans Hotel about halfway down the block. The site of the Bourbon Orleans Hotel was the Sisters of the Holy Family Convent, orphanage, and school for people of color before it became a hotel. The Sisters of the Holy Family used the site that is now the Bourbon Orleans Hotel starting in 1881 until 1964, so Henriette never served God at this location. The Sisters of the Holy Family are now housed in New Orleans East. Henriette died in 1862, possibly of tuberculosis. But a 1976 undergraduate thesis from Xavier University by Sister Mary Frances Borgia Hart suggested that the emotional and physical effects of the Battle of New Orleans and resulting occupation of the city during the Civil War contributed to her passing. In her will, she bequeathed an enslaved woman named Betsy to her brother, who she had inherited from her sister. St. Mary's Academy is the school for girls associated with the Sisters of the Holy Family. It was founded in 1867 and moved to this location on Orleans Street in 1881, and then to New Orleans East in 1965. The mission of the order has always included educating young women, and one notable alumna of St. Mary's is Leah Chase, the queen of Creole cuisine, who graduated in 1939. She was born on the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain, and no Catholic education was available to her as a person of color. Leah's family chose to send her to the city to attend St. Mary's Academy. But perhaps the most impressive graduates to come from St. Mary's graduated only a year ago. In 2023, 2 students, Nakia Jackson and Kelsey Johnson, each created new proofs for the Pythagorean theorem, a feat thought impossible for 2 millennia, and their accomplishment was worldwide news. They are in the process of being peer-reviewed for publication in a mathematics journal, cementing their place in mathematics history. Mother Henriette's legacy is on display in the hard work of the students of St. Mary's. Before it was a hotel or convent, the site of the Bourbon Orleans was the Théâtre d'Orléans. Just like the New Orleanians of today, the colonial Creoles loved music and dancing. Balls became a staple of life in New Orleans. One of the early governors of the colony, Governor Faujoy, who was governor from 1743 to 1753, was determined to make New Orleans the Petit Paris they had advertised. The culture of aristocracy with formalities and balls was adopted to help pass the time in the swamp. Public balls, private balls, subscription balls, carnival balls, and even the mysterious quadroon balls. During the Spanish colonial period, the musical enjoyment of opera was entertaining the elite colonists along with balls. According to the New Orleans Opera website, the first opera performed in New Orleans was Sylvain on May 22, 1796, at the Théâtre de la Rue Saint-Pierre. By 1815, the first Théâtre d'Orléans, where the Bourbon Orleans Hotel is now, was opened, and eventually this theater was the most important theater for the operatic season before the Civil War, hosting a number of nationwide premieres. This is also the location where the Orleans Ballroom was located, which is essential to the system of Plaçage that Henriette Delille was born into. While the existence of Bulbancha is probably the most unreported fact about New Orleans history, the concept of quadroon balls and plaçage is perhaps the most over-reported and embellished myth of New Orleans history. The legend holds that regular balls were held at the Orleans Ballroom and sometimes the Globe Theater that allowed women of color and white men to mix with the intention of finding a patron or protector who would provide for the woman and their children in an arrangement known as plaçage. In this arrangement, the white man had another white family who lived in a different house with him. He was responsible for providing a home and necessities for his placé and any children, but they did not live together. In Creole, the history and legacy of Louisiana's free people of color, Joan M. Martin's essay, Plaçage and the Louisiana Gens de Couleur Libre, How Race and Sex Define the Lifestyles of Free Women of Color, explains that this process was similar to debutante balls of society people in that the mothers were involved in the arrangements. Further, Martin asserts that this wasn't simply about sex, but the only option for free women of color in this period, as they were not legally allowed to marry outside of their race or marry enslaved people. Their only option to have a family in advance was to live as a placé. But modern research shows that the reports of the quadroon balls have been greatly exaggerated. In her book, The Strange History of the American Quadroon, Free Women of Color in the Revolutionary Atlantic World, Emily Clark's more recent research finds no evidence of plaçage contracts in the historical record, and very little evidence of quadroon balls. There is evidence of mixed-race families living together in 19th century New Orleans, but these relationships were more like a common-law marriage than a plaçage arrangement as described today, and only because it was not legal for people of different races to marry. The quadroon balls that occurred were likely for the pleasure of tourists who came to expect them based on reports from others that made their way around the world in sensationalistic newspaper articles, such as this 1852 article by Sir Edward Robert Sullivan, one of the few who actually claimed to attend a ball, which appeared in an English newspaper. While he describes the dancing in some detail, he spends 2/3 of his space discussing the murders that occurred while he was here. Quote, "As I was going up the stairs after getting my ticket and
replying to the quiet request whether I would leave my arms, that I had none to leave, I was stopped and searched from head to foot by a policeman, who, I suppose, fancied it impossible that I should be altogether without arms. Notwithstanding all this chaos, murders and duels are of weekly occurrences at these balls, and during my stay at New Orleans there were 3. There are more murders here than in any other city in the Union."
Unquote. Scholars note that this relentless myth of plaçage rests on the perception of women of African descent as irresistible seductresses who sought the favors of white men and could even be blamed for their position as a placé. Emily Clark refutes this as incongruent with the historical record about free women of color in the 19th century, who were devout family women, according to the documentation. In a 2018 interview with Lane Kaplan-Levinson for the podcast Tripod New Orleans at 300, in honor of the 300th anniversary of the colonization of New Orleans, Dr. Clark said,
"And so we rob them of having attained the ideal of being a lady when we erase their story and instead accept what was the story told about all black women, which was that, it's not white men's fault that they go to bed with black women and even that they rape them. It's the women's fault because they are so seductive. It's what they want. So it's that old story that's told, it's in the news right now. It's always the woman's fault. Well, it wasn't the woman's fault. And so when we buy this myth, we're buying into that really old, socially destructive, and just plain not historically accurate idea about women of African descent.
Let's consider this myth old news and accept that free women of color and white men lived in partnerships throughout the 18th and 19th centuries in New Orleans. They were not equal in their day, and they could not marry. But sources show that the partnerships were as loving as any between a white man and woman were at the time. Their status as, quote, ladies, was robbed from them in their time. But through modern research, we can return it to them in ours now. The loving and loyal relationships of free women of color and white men, along with the violent and forced relationships of the enslaved with enslavers, led to the Creole mixture of race in their children that New Orleans is famous for. But this truth is not unique to New Orleans. Dr. Clark also points out that the quadroon as a concept was not born in New Orleans, nor was it relegated to New Orleans in the antebellum times. In fact, it is well known on Ancestry DNA forums that all African Americans are likely to have significant European ancestry, not just those from the South, and not just the Creoles of New Orleans. Similarly, it is not uncommon for those with primarily European ancestry to find African ancestry in their results. This is often attributed to rape during slavery, which was common, but there were also free people of color who, quote, passed as white, and married white people, or just lived with a partner like marriage even though they couldn't marry, such as the story of Mrs. Henri Parlong, mother of the two sisters of the court. Perhaps because New Orleans had the largest and most prosperous population of free people of color, that this myth has survived and prospered here the most. Certainly, as Dr. Clark points out, it's at least in part the result of racism and those who couldn't fathom a world where a free woman of color would want to marry a black man and must seduce white men. I have been told my whole life, and in turn told visitors, that New Orleans is the most European city in America. While this is possibly true, it certainly erases the other cultures that have mixed to create this culture, primarily starting with the Native Americans and Africans, but also the people of South America, the Caribbean, and even Asia, who found their homes at the mouth of the Mississippi River. New Orleans isn't the most European city in America. New Orleans is the most post-colonial American city. This rich and intertwined gumbo of cultures drapes details on the sharp corners of truth without any need for myth or legend. Continuing, you'll probably see many artists with their art hung on the iron fence. This is a tradition that has long been observed in St. Anthony's Garden. The New Orleans Arts League was located on the corner where Trashy Diva now lives. We are lucky to have such talented artists display their work each day. Each artist receives a permit from the city, and all artists must display original artwork. No reproductions of any kind are allowed. Turn on the next block, Pirates Alley, and continue. You'll get another view of the gardens on your left. As you take in the picturesque scene, let's learn about some spirits you might be lucky enough to witness. There are at least 4 ghosts said to linger in the area surrounding St. Louis Cathedral: Pere Dagobert, Pere Antoine, Pirates, and William Faulkner. These are the legends. Pere Dagobert was the beloved priest before Pere Antoine arrived in New Orleans. He came in 1722 from Quebec and died in 1776. For nearly 50 years, throughout the entire French colonial period, Pere Dagobert was the remembered priest. His ghost is said to carry out the ritual of his miraculous good deed during his lifetime. When Governor Alexander O'Reilly, an Irish-born professional military leader at the service of the Spanish crown, arrived in New Orleans, his call for Spanish power involved first murdering the rebellious Frenchmen who would not comply with the Spanish authority. He shot them near the location where Frenchman Street is today. The legend holds that as a sign of just how little O'Reilly would tolerate rebellion, he refused to allow the Frenchmen a proper burial and instead left their bodies to rot where they fell. It was Pere Dagobert who insisted on defying O'Reilly's authority and giving the rebels a burial as required by their religion. Despite swarming guards, he is said to have dragged their bodies from the St. Charles Fort near the end of Frenchman Street today to St. Peter Street Cemetery, which occupied the block surrounded by St. Peter, Burgundy, Toulouse, and Rampart Streets. His singing spirit carries out this miraculous task in the morning mist in Pere Antoine Alley. Sometimes the tale says the Frenchmen were buried at St. Louis No. 1, but that cemetery was not built until 1789. Sometimes the bodies were on display on the banks of the river and brought to the church for a funeral, making their miraculous journey much shorter. Pere Dagobert also gets helpers to perform his miracle in some versions. We have news reports of the events and even a list of the 5 men who were executed. One of the men, Lafreniere, the Attorney General, is honored with a park named for him in nearby Metairie. There are 88 burials listed in the St. Peter Street Cemetery in the Find a Grave database, but none match the names of the Frenchmen. None of those buried in St. Peter Street were buried in 1769 because the records were lost in the 1788 fire when the church burned, making this ghost story all the more plausible. Frenchman Street is named by creative street namer Bernard de Marigny when he subdivided his neighborhood in 1805 in honor of these French rebels turned martyrs who defied the Spanish crown. The earliest reference I can find to Pere Dagobert in relation to the burial of the Frenchmen was in 1929. The earlier references to beloved Pere Dagobert are in relation to his singing. A poem written by Molly E. Moore Davis was printed in Harper's Weekly in 1887, more than 100 years after the priest's death. She refers to him as the singing Father Dagobert, with a clear voice everyone wanted to hear. She did not refer to his miracle with the Frenchmen in her prose. In the 1929 article from the New Orleans Item explains that the rumor began to circulate after O'Reilly killed the Frenchmen that Pere Dagobert was able to bury them in the yard of the church in unmarked graves. Gumbo Yaya, the 1945 book by Lyle Saxon about Louisiana folktales, does include Pere Dagobert, but the priest is not saintly in this version, and instead is gluttonous and worldly and haunts the cathedral in fine clothing. A more interesting truth than his time in New Orleans coinciding with the Spanish takeover is that he was in New Orleans when the Filles à la Cassette, the women who would become known to some as New Orleans' first vampires, arrived in New Orleans to live with the Ursuline nuns and become the wives for the settlers. In a 2022 article for The Advocate, Gordon Russell explained that some historians point to the Revolt of 1768 as a precursor to the American Revolution. Gordon explains that it is often considered the, quote, first uprising of the Atlantic world Creoles against imperial intrusions, unquote. He is quoting Lawrence Powell in The Accidental City. Unsurprisingly, New Orleans was once again at the front of the march toward becoming truly American. Pere Antoine arrived in New Orleans in 1780, and he is perhaps the most remembered priest from early New Orleans history. He is sometimes mistaken for the ghost of Pere Dagobert in Pere Antoine Alley, possibly because the alley honors him. Sometimes Pere Antoine is seen in Pirates Alley. Sometimes Pere Dagobert is in Pirates Alley also. Perhaps the two beloved priests have a spirited afterlife, debating theology and reminiscing about their time in New Orleans, as we are all wont to do. In the 1938 New Orleans City Guide, the Pirates Alley moniker is given no explanation. It proclaims, quote, on either side of the cathedral, running back the length of the block to Royal Street, are Orleans and St. Anthony alleys. The former has of recent years come to be known as Pirates Alley, though there is no basis for this name, unquote. Shannon Lee Doughty explains that the Pirates Alley nickname was adopted by 1922 to distinguish what was two alleys named Orleans on either side of the cathedral. The 1938 city guide also explains that fencing was once a common sport in the city, and that the area behind the cathedral was once the common location of duels. The book also cites an annual event held in St. Anthony's Garden on Mardi Gras Day of a fencing exhibition. I found references to the Mardi Gras Duello in the newspaper, but only in 1937 so far, the year the city guide was written. Legend holds that this space was used for duels in the city until the bishop decided it was too noisy to be near the church, and it was outlawed in 1855. The dueling moved to the area now known as City Park until it was fully outlawed in 1890. One dueling oak in City Park still stands just outside the entrance to the sculpture garden. Duels were once a common occurrence in antebellum and colonial New Orleans, and they had some rules. For instance, the challenger chose the weapon. Duels were often recounted in the newspapers also. There was no mention of duels in Shannon Lee Doughty's report of the archaeological evidence, so I emailed her to ask about any evidence for duels in her excavation. Here is her reply. Quote, "Well, I did find a few lead musket balls and shot in the garden, but since I'm convinced this space was used as a market space and campground in the 18th century, this is not at all surprising. They are ubiquitous on the sites of the era. Doesn't mean that they were fired. Made of lead, they could have also served as weights for various things or used as gaming pieces, etc., or just a random lost item from a hunter or soldier. In terms of the archives, no evidence duels happened here that I've seen, though there are a couple of cases documented elsewhere. See The Devil's Empire. It's one of those stories that is probably half true, but we'll never know which half." Unquote. Did the Pirates Alley nickname come from the custom of dueling among the Creoles? Another theory is that the alley was used by actual pirates to sell their wares. Using the space as a marketplace, much like the artists lining the fence do today, is a tradition as old as the colony of New Orleans, according to Doughty's excavation. From Native American markets in the early colonial days to a pleasure garden in the antebellum time, which ended with the erection of the fence, now artists lining the fence carry on a century-old tradition of New Orleanians sharing their talent with visitors and spreading the products of the city around the world. The artists probably mingle and mix easily with any pirates lingering between realms. Around the time that the fence became an art gallery, the 1920s, an unknown writer lived with another man in 624 Pirates Alley. He wrote a novel in 1925. His voyage to the city was not unique. Many artists spent time in New Orleans then, like now, leading to the public art shows he probably witnessed. His time in the city was short, about 6 months, but the novel he wrote while he was here was published, and eventually he published more. He became a Nobel laureate and one of the most renowned American writers, William Faulkner. His home is currently a bookstore where some claim to smell his tobacco smoke when they visit. About halfway down Pirates Alley, just after the Faulkner House bookstore, you'll find another alley running behind the Cabildo to St. Peter Street. Today we call this Cabildo Alley, but it was the end of Exchange Alley in the past. Exchange Alley was built to facilitate commerce between the Americans in Faubourg Saint-Marie, now the Central Business District, and the Creoles in the Vieux Carré. You can find other remnants of it in the French Quarter closer to Canal Street. It is no coincidence that this alley ran directly to both the St. Louis Hotel, now the Omni Royal Orleans, and the Cabildo, the site of the government. The St. Louis Hotel Rotundo was a site of significant trade in enslaved people who were a primary commodity in New Orleans, and the Cabildo once had a prison on the grounds. If tortured energy is what leads to ghosts, certainly the area remains populated. I've seen one reference to a ghost of Madame Lalaurie haunting the cathedral grounds. This seemed to be more about search engine optimization to me than any basis in actual lore or truth, so I guess I'm doing the same. Make sure to watch my video of what really happened at the Lalaurie Mansion. Thank you for joining me on this tour of St. Anthony's Garden in New Orleans. St. Anthony is the patron saint of lost objects. He was probably the most invoked saint growing up in South Louisiana, where my mom still tells me to pray to St. Anthony if I've lost something. I find it wonderfully poetic that St. Anthony's Garden helped us piece together some lost answers to mysteries about the historical French Quarter, including how much the Native Americans initially interacted with and likely helped the colonists. Please like and subscribe for more From the Deep coming soon.